Hello there, and thank you for tuning into this video. We're going to talk about one of my favorite, if not my favorite, books in the Bible, stories in the Bible. And we're going to talk about probably one of my favorite characters in the Bible. We are going to be talking about this beautiful gal right here. Isn't she beautiful? This is an artist rendition of Queen Esther. Queen Esther was a warrior, and she was actually one of the most influential characters in the Bible. And she was so influential, there's a book of the Bible named after her. So I think you're going to agree that she was a warrior. So I originally did this message for an online men's ministry that I'm part of, and I just thought that it was worthy sharing with the bigger audience. So what comes to your mind when you think of the book of Esther, and why would we be talking about a woman in a men's ministry? Track with me, and I think you will agree that Esther was a G. Just a note, though, that God is not mentioned a lot, if at all, in the book of Esther. However, if you have read it, you know that God is all over in the Esther story. Let me set the scene for how Esther made history and therefore ended up in the Bible. So if you grab your Bible, we'll be starting off in chapter 1. Let me take you on a journey through the Esther story. We start out in Esther chapter 1, verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the seven eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. For she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him. First off, she refused? She refused the king? Man, I don't think that's very smart. And clearly, the king was not happy about it. Now, that takes some guts. Something tells me there's going to be a job opening of sorts. So let's read on. Verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment. Verse 14. The men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsena, and Memucan, the seven princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. Verse 15. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? So the king, again, was angry, rightly so, and he could have done whatever he wanted. He could have acted out of emotion or anger, but he did have enough wherewithal to ask his trusted advisors. Verse 16. Then Memucan, or royal counselor, said in the presence of the king and the officials, so not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. So it was a slap in the face to pretty much everybody, anybody that had respect for the king. It was basically a big middle finger to not only the king, which was bad enough, but to the officials and all the people in the king's territory. Verse 17. For the queen's behavior will be known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. So, in other words, the women are going to follow the example. Maybe some of them will follow the example and will be rebellious also of sorts. So it was like a global women's march of sorts. Once the women in the provinces saw that the queen can rebel basically and get away with it, they could too. But did she get away with it? Not hardly. Verse 18. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So, in other words, he wants to replace her with somebody that's not going to be rebellious or that's not going to slight him. So it kind of makes me think, as a side note, of Matthew 23, 11, and 12. So the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So in this context, whoever exalts herself will be humbled, and whoever humbles herself will be exalted. So the queen, well, former, exalted herself and was humbled. And as a side note for later, Haman, which you're going to learn about later, exalted himself and was humbled. So, in the context of Matthew 23, 11, and 12, you'll see later about that and how this all comes into play. So, the scene for Esther's next has been set. So, we continue in chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under custody of Hegai the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So in comes Mordecai, and even though he played a vital role in Esther's story, we won't spend too much time talking about him, as this is again Esther's story. But Mordecai was actually Esther's cousin, and he was older, and he kind of looked out for her when her parents passed away. So, verse 7, he, Mordecai, was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So again, he kind of looked out for her and watched out for her and took care of her. And now the path to the crown. So in verse 8, so when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young women pleased him and won his favor. He quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. So Esther finally made it to the elites, I guess you could say. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her to not to make it known. Wait for it. We skip to verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Again, she was beautiful. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther, if you remember back to when we were talking about the side note in Matthew 23, 11, and 12, Esther humbled herself and was exalted and is now queen. And then Mordecai humbled himself and was exalted, and you'll see that a little bit later. So we jump to chapter 4 to find out why I think Esther is worthy of a warrior, of being called a warrior. So in chapter 3, it talks about Haman and how he fed the king a story, and which then led to his plot to kill the Jews. So, as a side note, part of why Mordecai instructed Esther not to tell of who she was because she was a Jew. And so that was Esther's people. So as we move into chapter 4, Mordecai learns of Haman's plot and is understandably upset and tore his clothes. Esther learned of this and not only sent clothes, but sent Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, to find out what was going down and gave him a copy of the written decree to show Esther. She then sent Hathach back to tell Mordecai. So we continue in chapter 4, verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death. That is extreme. So, except the one, though, whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he, or she, in this case, may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So Mordecai's reply to Esther, verse 13. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? One of the most powerful sentences, I think, in the Bible, for such a time as this. So, in those days, you didn't just drop by the palace and say, what up, homie? I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by. That could have a bad outcome for you. Mordecai knew the risk in that, but he also knew the cost of not taking that risk. Relief and deliverance will come regardless of her actions if it be God's will. But what if God is using this to teach her courage? And if she doesn't rise up, she won't realize that courage. It's in her. She just has to realize it and use it. So, how did it work out? So, Esther prepares the banquet. Chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was like, man, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom. So, Esther has now won the favor of the king and asked to have a banquet so she can pull Haman's covers. So, remember, we kind of talked about Haman earlier in this video, and now it's Haman's coming into play into the story. So Haman joyfully goes because he thinks it is an honor to go to the banquet with the king and queen. But what he doesn't know is what Esther does know. Haman goes home and shares about his royal invite and also how Mordecai dissed him, and that ticked him off. So they talked up a plot to hang Mordecai. So at the end of chapter 5, Haman makes a gallows to hang Mordecai on. So the wrench in Haman's plot. So, chapter 6, verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Verse 2. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. The plot thickens. Verse 4, and the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. Again, Haman doesn't know what the king knows. And the king's young men told him, Haman is there standing in the court, and the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, thinking he was talking about him, and Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, Let royal robes be brought which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes, probably reluctantly, but he took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman's covers are about to be pulled. The king's eunuchs come to bring Haman to the banquet Esther has prepared. Chapter 7, verse 2. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom. It shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he? Who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. He was probably sitting there going, oh no. After that, we know that Haman is hanged on the very gallows he had made to hang Mordecai on. Talk about irony. At the beginning of chapter 8, King Ahasuerus gives the house of Haman to Esther and Mordecai, then comes before the king after Esther had said what he was to her, and takes off his signet ring and gives it to Mordecai. So Esther then puts Mordecai in charge of the house of Haman. Esther then goes into the king and falls at his feet and pleads for the Jews. The king then tells them to use the ring to seal an edict to revoke the letters that Haman had written to destroy the Jews. The edict is written, sealed, and delivered. The Jews, Esther's people, are about to be saved. So, are you still wondering why we talked about Esther in a men's ministry message? Esther had more courage than I've seen in a lot of men, including myself at times. If you read the story of Esther, she was faced with a difficult decision, but if you read the story, you'll know that she did consider the cost. She thought of the cost if she did step out of her comfort zone in fear, and while this would have cost her greatly up to and including her life, she knew the cost was much greater if she didn't step out. I can think of many times I've been faced with decisions, and sometimes I've chosen the easy way out because I was scared, I was fearful. But God does not call us to a life of comfort. As a matter of fact, He calls us out of our comfort. And in my experience and the experience of Esther, way out. I wonder what it would have looked like for Esther and her people if she took the easy, comfortable way out. Pretty sure it would not have been good, and what she was afraid of could have prevented her from making a decision that would prevent something much, much worse. And not only that, would have resulted in many others experiencing something not so good. Esther didn't really think about herself. She looked beyond herself and her comfort and thought of others. She was a world changer. She might not have changed the whole world, but she changed the world for her people, a lot of people. When God needs or wants to do something great, He will often use His people, us, to help carry His plan out. God will bring us to a point of doing something great in His power for His glory. And if God wills it, He will see to it that His will is carried out with us or without us. God would have carried out His will and plan in the days of Esther, and if she didn't step up, He would have used someone else, and the story would have been so much different. God was not mentioned in this book, but God was all up in it. And think about all the times where I've been on the brink of making a decision, and I know God's will is going to be done, but do I want to just sit on the sidelines? No, I want to leave it. I'm going to leave it all on the field daily because out of our comfort zone, that's where growth happens. That's where freedom happens. So recently, I was at a conference and I was asked if I could step in and help run the sound as the scheduled tech guys had a family emergency and couldn't make it. So at last minute, the tech guys were not able to fly into North Carolina to do the tech. So at breakfast, they leaned over and they're like, "Hey, we know you do tech stuff at church and stuff. Would you be willing to help out?" So, the first thing that came to my mind was, I can't do that. I'm not qualified as I don't have the experience. So I do tech stuff, but I'm not a front of house guy, and that's what they were asking me to help with. So once I stepped out of my own way in fear and got out of my own mind, I stepped in and said, God, you brought me to this. You will bring me through it, and I trust you. The tech wasn't perfect that weekend, but God doesn't command us to be a perfect son. He commands obedience to a perfect God. So back to Esther. In my opinion, Esther was a warrior, and I think she deserved to wear a Warrior Elite shirt. So, Warrior Elite's one of our challenges, and you have to complete the challenge to prove that you're a warrior to get the shirt. I think Esther was very worthy of wearing that shirt. So, God has not even come close to asking us to do anything close to serious as what he asked of Esther, yet we don't. Why? Fear, anxiety, doubt? Don't you think Esther felt those emotions? Probably all of them at the same time. But she decided there was much higher cost. God knew what she didn't, but she didn't have to know. So let's take it back to the ladies. We as men are called to not only lead with courage, but also lead in courage. I'm not going to tell you married people what to do in your marriage, as I've never been married. But even us single guys have women and or girls we are leading in our lives. I have a 22-year-old niece, and I am commanded by God with the honor of leading her. Sure, I don't lead her as her dad does, but that doesn't negate the command to lead her. What are we doing to lead, encourage, and help them realize the Esther in them? Are we telling them how we think they should do it, or are we leading them and walking with them and pointing them to the word where it tells them how they should do it and how they can be an Esther? So I had this experience when I was a kid and about stepping out of fear into courage. So my grandparents had a built-in swimming pool. This was in California, and we lived with them for a while. And I had a little girlfriend next door, and she would come over and we would swim, me and my brother and Susie, and sometimes our cousins would come over. But I was always very fearful of swimming. I didn't really know how to swim. So what I did was I just hung on to the edge of the pool and worked my way around, and I never let go and got into the deep, into the water. And and it took me a long time, and it might be because I had an uncle that just threw me into the deep end because he thought that's how you teach a kid to learn how to swim, and that's how you teach them to not be fearful of the water. I'm sure he meant well, but it didn't really work. So one day, Susie's over there, and I'm holding on to the edge of the pool like normal, and she gets up on the diving board and jumps off. And that did something in me. I don't know if it was having my little girlfriend show me up, or I don't know what it was, but God used her to do something in me. And I got out of the pool, walked to the diving board, jumped off into the deep end. My fear was gone. It was gone. And I learned through that when I was holding on to that edge of the pool, that was ultimately what was preventing me from going into the deep end, going into the water, because I was holding on to something. And when we hold on to fear, when we hold on to anxiety, when we hold on to things, we're not holding on to God, and that keeps us from really experiencing life. So with that, um, fear, anxiety, all those things will try to water down your courage. And I'm sure we all have a story. If you just take a minute, think about when you were a kid, and just think about a story where fear crippled you, and where then you think back now how you overcame that. And I think Esther is, she had to overcome fears that probably none of us have or will ever experience. But the fact is, she overcame them because of God. So I challenge you, the next time one of the ladies in your life is losing their special symbol, special symbol, special symbol, special symbol exclamation, instead of avoiding the unavoidable and running away, jump. Jump in the ditch with her and listen. You don't have to fix the issue. And a lot of times, what I've learned is they don't want you to fix it. They just want you to listen and help her to find her courage. Help her to find the Esther that's in there. I promise you, it's in there. Help her find it. That's what being a warrior is. Thank you.